Welcome to Studio Snack. I'm Lydia Thornley, designer, creative director and sketcher.
And I'm Narciso Leda, brand, graphic and digital designer, and I always have a can of lentils in my drawer.
What? This month's topic is snack stash. Not an easy thing to say quickly or slowly. And it may seem an odd one at harvest time, traditionally a time of plenty, but it's also the time of year when creatures stash away supplies for the winter. But our topic started with me getting COVID for the first time, unfashionably late.
Very late.
Very late. So thinking about shopping without shopping when you can't leave the house. And that got Narcissus thinking about lockdown food during the pandemic. How weird was your store cupboard?
I have to confess that we always had a cupboard full of cans. Like, I call it the apocalypse cupboard because I just keep it there, just in case. You never know when you're going to use it. But for some reason, we have a lot of jackfruit, which I think is like a hangover of the veganary of one of the years. And we've never used it. I don't even know what to use it for.
I still have a can of mushy peas and a sachet of seaweed.
As you do.
As you do.
What this month we didn't have a lot, as in September. It was time, because you being ill and having a lot of projects, and then me being working away and having a lot of work, the universe simply conspired against us, or helping us to find some ways to create this podcast. Scarcity, isn't it? So Lydia, how did you manage?
Well, it's 2024 in London and we have our online shopping game sorted. There are speedy supermarket deliveries and pretty much every online food delivery app also does groceries. Pricey but convenient.
What about places that is not, the food is scarce or is not that convenient? You have some nerdery, haven't you, Lydia?
I do. In space. In the earliest days of space travel, scientists didn't even know if you could eat in zero gravity. The first ever space food was beef and liver paste in a toothpaste tube. Not great if you were veggie then. With chocolate pudding for afters. Better.
I love that you went straight to space, like couldn't go further, can you?
Of course. There was the corned beef sandwich scandal, one of those space stories that got embroidered over time, about an astronaut sneaking one aboard and the dire consequences that crumbs might have, which turned out to be less of a drama than it seemed. Space food has a bad reputation mostly because what we see in museums is the stuff nobody wanted to eat. But nutrition and safety are priorities. Better packaging forms, design comes into that obviously, meant more options for astronauts. And the Johnson Space Centre has a food lab that researches and develops food for space missions. Crews are involved in choosing their own menus, which I didn't realise.
Space snacks.
Yeah.
Sounds interesting.
And interestingly, NASA's info includes pantry items for use if a mission is unexpectedly extended, which is topical given the latest mission. And then there's the ocean. I saw a TV interview recently with the young rower Zoe Loughlin, who talked about having dried food and a device that converts seawater to fresh water so that she can rehydrate it. She will need, because she's rowing, 4,000 calories per meal.
Wow.
And there are normally ration packs for that, but I found a Guardian article about Jasmine Harrison, the youngest woman to row solo across the Atlantic, who lived entirely on biscuits and chocolate. She joked possibly 40 kilos of chocolate.
That sounds heaven to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wouldn't row that much for that.
On the more serious side, food aid to disaster zones is an interesting one. What do you put in a food box or basket to keep people going? Well, I took a look at the World Food Programme's information about that, and there's a lot for people to think about, including whether aid programmes are providing for all of somebody's needs or supplementary rations, demographics, cultural factors, activity levels. There's also the psychological impact of a good meal, and World Central Kitchen was set up on that basis, started by chefs. And then I started wondering about Anderson shelters in World War II in the UK. These were corrugated iron shelters in people's back gardens. And we had one outside our cottage when I was growing up, and I imagined them to be stocked with all sorts of supplies, but I couldn't find anything on that, perhaps because they were pretty unpleasant places to be in and could flood. But what was interesting was the extent to which people would learn how to preserve things at a time of rationing. And preserving for supply through winter was a skill passed down, and it's coming back into fashion through permaculture and ferment projects like the House of Ferment by Grisdale Arts. which used research and travels in Japan, Korea, Poland and China. Narcis, you had info on cured meats.
Yes, as someone who grew up in Catalonia, cured meat is like a daily, is bread and cured meat every day. So, but cured meat comes from really, really long time ago. So, as some cave paintings in Sicily suggest, at the beginning of was mostly smoked and salt cured, but there is some records about sausage in Roman times. But on the medieval times was great for cured meats because salt beef was invented and consumed for all social classes. Cured meat was great for sailors and for adventurers in the 18th century. And of course, we're talking about meat that we can cure, but we could also be talking about milk or fish, which also is known as cheese and fish.
And we talk about squirreling things away, so what can we learn from actual squirrels? Well, as we all know, they stash food in times of plenty in multiple sites. What I didn't know is that they're also sneaky. Because there's a lot of pilfering, they will dig decoy sites where they haven't actually stashed anything. And Narcis, you discovered a great story about jays.
Yeah, so this is an interesting story. I had to kind of refresh my memory and learn some of the new facts because I knew it in some way in my mind. But basically, I knew that jays buried acorns to keep it for later, like squirrels. But the memory is not as good as the squirrels. So jays are credited to spread a lot of the oak tree, and it's estimated that each bird might hide up to 5,000 acorns in autumn. How would you remember that anyway? So there's forests that they believe to just be created by jays.
And there are tortoises which hibernate, and that's more technical than it looks. You don't just have a nap on a wake me up when there's food basis. They're not from round here, so our climate is a bit of a challenge for them, and they don't all hibernate. For those who do hibernate, they start with being at the right temperature and digesting their food properly. And when they come out of hibernation, they have to be kept at the right temperature, bathed regularly, and offered food, which kind of works for me too. Narcis,
You should do that.
Narcis, going back to lockdown, you were thinking about how people panicked and started stockpiling. What did you find out about that?
It was like living a catastrophic movie, isn't it?
It was.
So I remember reading a book from Ignacio Ramonet. This is like a Catalan Spanish writer, where he was touching the idea that visual media influence our behavior, particularly in supermarkets. And basically, it's what we saw, like people just emptying the shelves. And it was incredible that we had to be rationed 2 cans per person, and how this scarcity made people aggressive, angry.
So this month's creative experiments have been all about ration books and preserving. What would a modern ration book look like? What is the food we miss most and would most want to preserve? For me, that's apples.
For me, it's chocolate.
So what was your experiment?
So because I had to do this from away when I was in Harrogate, and I was quite busy with work, and also then in the evenings we were socializing a little bit. I had very little time, and also I had very little resources because I didn't have a printer, I didn't have a cutting board, I didn't have much. So I decided to take that as advantage and use just only paper and a pen. And I created a ration book. So then I kind of created this game about is either this or either that. And for example, Lydia, what would you choose, chocolate or a pen to draw?
And I have a story about that, where my friend Elle, who was drawing a regular view, had discovered she had no pens one day, but she did have chocolate, so she drew with that.
So you wouldn't choose. Okay, that was a bad example, but you know what I mean. I created a ration book where you had to choose between cheese or wine, popcorn or Netflix, ice cream or a day in the beach. What did you do?
Well, I did 2 experiments. You know me.
Of
I
course.
never make life easy for myself. It started with looking at the simplest way of keeping apples fresh, which is storing them in newspaper. And we used to do that when I was a kid. But I wondered, what if we stored them in recipes so that when you got them out, you instantly had a way to cook them? So I got out a handwritten recipe book I made when I went to college. I have no idea what I was thinking. It's like rereading teenage diaries. And I scanned and printed them on some scrap paper and wrapped the apples in them and photographed them. And the other one was about the squirrels and their decoy food stash. I had some acorns in my kitchen, and I made pressed patterns with the tops in air-dried clay. Photographing them reminded me that when you press a pattern into something, there's a trick of the light that happens that makes it really hard to tell whether it's an impression into the material or a leaf image standing on top of it.
That's
so
super
a
cool.
trick from a trick.
It's very cool. We'll put all this in our social media as usual to have a look.
What does this tell us then about our design practice? The thing that stood out for me was that all of the stuff that works requires thinking and planning ahead. And how do we do that in times when everything is available on demand? It made me think about some very pressured design process I've had to navigate recently, with rolling delays which no room for the unexpected. Forward planning makes design process better on a design level and better for everyone on a human level.
Yes, for me, I was thinking about the scarcity and how that makes things more valuable. What I was saying earlier about the 2 cans, only having 2 cans of lentils was making people angry. And that is actually a very typical marketing tactic where you say only 1 week before the offer ends, or Ryanair says there's only 2 seats in this price. The other thing that I actually was thinking when I read that book is the behavioral education that we get through the visuals, and how during lockdown I saw like the best behavior and the worst behavior. I saw people helping, which I also saw people going into parties when you meant to be doing social distancing. And why this is important? I was thinking about our experiment. How about ration books could be tailored as well? Because for you might be more important a pen than chocolate, but for other people they would rather have Netflix than food, for example.
And of course now in the cost of living crisis, as people cook, they're rationing energy. So if you're cooking something, you're using energy. How are you going to spend that energy? And might you be batch cooking? All of those decisions people are having to make.
Yeah.
Seaweed?
Do I look like a fish? Come on, give me one.
Join us next month for another studio snack.